You're now listening to the Laravel Podcast. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Laravel Podcast Season 6. I'm one of your hosts, Matt Stauffer, and Taylor.
And I'm Taylor Otwell, creator of Laravel.
Hell yeah. So we have a lot on our plate. We actually have more things on our plate that we'll probably actually get to today, so I'm just going to get started and walk through it. I know there have been some new releases and updates going on lately, so before I ask you any questions, can you just kind of give us the update about what's going on in the world of Laravel and what's new?
Oh yeah, gosh, lots of stuff. So
yeah,
on the open source side, we've been doing a lot of work on a couple of different things. One is sort of the whole onboarding experience for Laravel, which is like a never-ending mission for me to improve continuously. Yeah. And so there's kind of two aspects to that we've done recently. One is this new Php.new thing that Marcel worked on after some coaxing and encouraging from my side of like really wanting this for a long time. And it was actually my original idea for something. What turned into Laravel Herd was actually a much simpler app that was just PHP. And it maybe sat in your menu bar. It was very much inspired by this Postgres.app app that exists where it just sits in your menu bar and all it does is run Postgres. There's not even really like a big UI for it or anything like that. And I really wanted something like that for PHP because I am not a huge fan of Homebrew, mainly because I feel like it just is a big black box that I don't really understand. And anytime you update something, all of these other things update, and it just feels very fragile in a way.
Yeah.
Which we've experienced some with like Valet, right? Of just like you can get yourself in a mess with Homebrew. Yeah. So with Php.new, which came out, I think last week, you basically just have a command line or a command that you paste into your terminal that's something like, curl php.new /install /Mac or something like that. And then you pipe that into your shell and it installs a self-contained PHP Composer and Laravel installer. And it doesn't use any package managers or Homebrew or anything like that. It's totally self-contained, and it puts that in your path so that in just like a few seconds you can do Laravel new my app, and you have a Laravel app, you have PHP, you have Composer. If you want to update PHP, you just run the command again. So it's just like super minimal, super easy. So that was one part, and then which I was really excited to get out there. I've already started using it some locally. And then another thing we shipped this week is a new Composer script, which we probably should have shipped a long time ago. So it's just a one line in your Composer file that's a dev script. And Composer you can define arbitrary scripts in your Composer file that you just do Composer run script name, and it runs the commands that you tell it to. But what this one does is use the concurrently package to spin up the Artisan web server, a queue worker, the Vite dev server, and tails your application logs sort of all in one terminal window, and they're all like kind of have color-coded outputs so you can see what's coming from which program. And so that just gives you like one command, Composer run dev, to start up the whole app. And if you combine that with Php.new, it means you can just spin something up really quickly. Like you unbox a new laptop, Php.new, Composer run dev, the app is running, you have a queue worker, you're tailing your logs, the Vite is running with hot reload and everything like that. I think it's just like a really quick onboarding experience, and it feels, I think, more familiar and more streamlined to people that are not typically used to PHP. I think a lot of this was actually spurred by feedback from Theo Brown, who is sort of a tech educator, commentator, journalist online, popular on Twitter, and he tried Laravel and sort of documented his hangups, which I think some people found like dramatic or whatever. I don't think that was really his intention at all, even though of course he wants to get engagement and impressions like on his content. Yeah. I don't think it was like supposed to be mean-spirited or anything, but I actually found it really helpful. So we had a private call, and we walked through like all of his sort of like, it was basically just his stream of consciousness as he built some things with Laravel and what he found confusing, what he didn't totally understand, what he thought was bad, what he thought it was good. Yeah. And so some of this stuff was just directly inspired from that. That's awesome. And this Composer dev script was actually something that he wrote for his project, and I was like, hey, can you just send me that command? And then I kind of like played with it a little bit, and now we shipped it out there. So I thought that was really cool.
That's cool. And I know when I was working with Rails, there was in Heroku, there was a really common tool, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, where you'd set a definition of all the processes you want to be running, and Heroku would use that file to run, but then also you had this little local thing, and I wanted to say middleman, but that's not right, but this little local thing that you would run, and it would run all of them. And I had set those up a couple times for Laravel projects, but I didn't know that concurrently exists. That's an NPM package, right?
Right, yeah, and it's a really simple package where you just say concurrently, and then you pass it all of the commands you want to run concurrently.
Nice.
And that's
so
really
we
all
could
there is
also
to
make
it.
our own, right? Like if you got your own project, you can modify the existing one. And the cool thing about that is like if your thing has 3 dependencies running that the native Laravel app doesn't, everybody you modify that command, and then everybody who picks up the project after you doesn't even need to know what all needs to be running. They just run that same script, and all of a sudden it spills everything up. That's really nice.
Yeah, totally. And like when I first put it out there, some people, their feedback was, why not have like an artisan dev command or something? And I think the reason for that is what you just said. Like the really nice thing about it just being a composer script is you can just pop open the composer file and edit it if it's not like up to what you want. Like if you want it to use Horizon instead of the normal key worker, or you want to add a command, or you want to remove a command, like if it was baked into the framework in this like command artisan dev way, we need all these hooks and like ways for you to customize it that we just don't need if it's just a string in your composer file, which is so easy to customize.
Yeah, and I like the idea of keeping things lower level when there's no reason for them to be higher level. Like if at some point you get to the point where like, oh, this is complex enough that we need it to be tested and everything, okay, then maybe you move into PHP. But if it doesn't need to be, why even make PHP be involved,
Yeah.
That's really cool. I'm very excited about that. And when I first thought about it, I was like, okay, that's cool. And the more I thought about it and the way it's going to benefit teams, like onboarding new people, not just the onboarding of new developers, but also onboarding new people into a team, and just say, because one of the things we first do at Titan when we take over a project is we say, we're going to read through the whole thing, we're going to get it set up, and then we're going to make your onboarding process faster for new developers, because it's going to make it faster for us, but also we're usually helping people hire. And so we're like, we want to make it faster for your next hire after us. And this is one of the first things is like, what dependencies do I need running? What things do I need to install? What things do I need to run it every single time? And this, I just feel like that shrinks that cost, not just for developers new to the framework, but people new to a project. So I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, super cool. And then the other open source thing we've shipped out this week, was it this week or end of last week? I think it was end of last week, was the Inertia 2 beta, the first beta for that.
It's very exciting.
Yeah, so we're super pumped to get that out there, and it includes Vue, React, and Svelte support, I believe. We did drop Vue 2 support, so you have to be on Vue 3. But it includes everything that I showed at Laracon, like the prefetching, the deferred props, the infinite scrolling stuff. And the infinite scrolling stuff is actually about to get a whole lot better.
Oh, nice.
That in the next beta, I think it's going to be really sweet. There's actually an infinite scrolling component that builds on top of the when visible primitives that I showed at Laracon. That makes it like even easier and less boilerplate, especially if you're using like Laravel conventions for pagination and stuff.
Nice.
Includes all the polling stuff, but yeah, everything that I showed at Laracon is now out in beta, and we actually have a V2 version of the Inertia website up at v2.inertia.js.com, where you can read the upgrade guide, which is not much because there's basically no breaking changes except for dropping Vue 2 support.
Wow.
Which is awesome. You get to tap into all of this really cool stuff without really, you definitely do not have to rewrite your app or make any substantial changes to your app, which I think is really, really cool. We've been using Inertia 2 internally on Laravel Cloud for weeks and weeks. And yeah, it's been really great and awesome.
Nice. That's a lot going on. It's because normally I'm just like, oh, like what's happened in the last couple of weeks? And it's like, oh, minor. Those are 3 pretty significant things. And Php.new, I don't know why. Maybe I saw like an early version or something, but I didn't realize it was so stripped down. It's literally just a couple steps. And it's a couple steps for a JavaScript developer. It's also a couple steps for a WordPress developer. I've been thinking a lot lately about like some of the conversations I've had with some folks, 5-10 years ago about how do we ease the process of WordPress developers who want to learn Laravel. And with the climate right now, I'm guessing we're going to have an influx. And I'm like, oh, well, if you've been working on WAMP, or whatever else, this gets you up and running with the more modern dependencies and stuff like that. So I love that.
Yeah, totally. It's been interesting to see the stats on Php.new as well, because we've actually been keeping track of the operating systems that are most commonly using this, and we're seeing a lot of Linux adoption on Php.new, which I honestly would have expected that to be the least, because just apt-get install PHP or something. But it's been pretty popular across that.
That's very cool
in that operating system as well.
I love it. All right, so we have a suite of questions left over from last time that we either didn't get to or they came in after we recorded the last one. Things about cloud and everything. So I just want to walk through those real quick before we move to any other topics. So some questions we had. First is, do you think cloud will have a minimum required version of PHP or Laravel to run?
I think in the current version of Cloud, we support PHP 8.2 and 8.3, and 8.4 comes out next month. So, I mean, by the time Cloud comes out, I'm sure we'll have 8.4 support. As far as the minimum Laravel version, that's a great question. I'm sure it would support any version of Laravel that runs on PHP 8.2. I don't know off the top of my head what that would be or what that would mean, but, it's got to be Laravel 10, maybe even Laravel 9 would run on 8.2.
Laravel 9 runs on it.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
anybody curious, we maintain laravelversions.com, and one of the things it does is shows you the PHP versions, and it looks like Laravel 9 is the earliest one. I think this person was on 6 or something, and I was like, nah, you're not gonna get Laravel 6 support.
Yeah, I think it's more gonna be the PHP version that gets you more than like the Laravel version. You know what I mean? So if we're supporting PHP 8.2 at minimum, whatever works with that would be the minimum required Laravel version.
Okay. Next question about cloud was, will it have a public-facing API?
It definitely will at some point. I don't know what will be available as far as public-facing API on day one. I think what we would like to have when we go general access early next year is at least a way to trigger deployments via a public API, because we know people are going to want to hook into GitHub Actions and things like that. As far as like pulling, all of your team members and projects, I'm sure that will all get fleshed out over time. But I think we'll have the core pieces in place for day one, and then we'll just continue to improve it, as we go through the year.
Okay. So the next one is from Tony Macias at Titan. So he loves the original Laravel Cloud code that he got a copy of when you first released it. And one of the things he asked is, is that code still out there? He may have the answer, but I'm asking that. But his question was, did any code from the original Laravel Cloud make its way in either directly or as inspiration for the new Laravel Cloud?
No, not really. First, the code does still exist. We have the code in a private repo in the Laravel org. But no, we didn't pull anything from Laravel Cloud, the original Laravel Cloud, into the what became Laravel Cloud now. And to give some context for listeners that weren't around during that period, before I wrote Vapor, I started working on a project that I was calling Laravel Cloud. So this would have been like late 2018, maybe early 2018, late 2017, honestly. And it was more like a Forge 2.0, you might say, where it had like a YAML file to configure your web servers, worker servers, and then you hit like cloud deploy and it provisioned everything. But it was still like VPSs behind the scenes, and it wasn't fully managed. It was still self-managed, unlike Laravel Cloud, which is like a true platform as a service. But we even did front-end designs. I think Steve Shoger from Tailwind, who was working for me and you at the time, I think, did front-end designs for it. And so the app was like basically done, right? I mean, honestly. And when I got to the end, I just did not feel like it was that much better than Forge to warrant like launching this whole new product. Yeah. It was just a very minor improvement over Forge for probably a minority of users that care about like actually scaling across web servers. My hunch is most people using Forge are just running on one web server. Yeah. But so I open sourced the code, and I don't even remember what happened. For some reason I ended up closing the code back up. I don't think people liked some of the ways. I think they expected it to be like this very advanced secret way of writing Laravel apps that is like so much more productive. And when they saw that it was like, oh, this is just like how the documentation shows you writing Laravel apps, I think people were like let down in a way that it wasn't like some silver bullet to all of their architectural woes. I think it was honestly good code. I will say that the code in Laravel Cloud, the style of how it was written, lives on in Laravel Vapor 100%. Because it is written very much like Laravel Cloud was written, with kind of fat models, which I think is something that people did not expect or appreciate in the Laravel Cloud database, which I still think is great, by the way.
I love it.
So you could say the spiritual successor was Vapor, both in goals, in the sense that it provided that auto-scaling next-level infrastructure for a Laravel app, but also in the style of code and how it was written. Vapor carries on a lot of what you would see in Cloud.
Well, I know that the those of us who got a copy of Cloud before it disappeared, or even just looked at it before it disappeared, have often looked to it for like, how would Taylor do this kind of thing? And it's
I should sell those. I should sell golden floppy disks with the Laravel Cloud.
Oh man, I would buy it.
And
I'd have it right there.
That'd be funny.
All right. So the last outstanding question was, someone said, I saw you when we had a VS Code extension at Laracon announced, but then I saw you using Sublime Text on stage. What do you actually use for your IDE?
I still do use Sublime, and we laughed about that at Laracon backstage. We're like, is it weird that we're going to do this VS Code demo and then I'm going to hop into Sublime Text? It's just muscle memory for me. I like VS Code a lot, and I still would like to maybe move over to that just because it's where a lot of developer momentum is. And even trying stuff like Cursor, which is based on VS Code, I think would be fun because I've been using AI a little bit more in my dev work. But yeah, I'm still on Sublime. It's just so fast, but using Caleb Porzio's like Make VS Code Awesome ebook, I think I got VS Code configured in a way where it's like if Sublime died tomorrow, I wouldn't have to quit programming. I could continue working productively in VS Code because the key mappings are mostly the same. Yeah. Keith at Titan still holds out strong in Sublime Text, and not only does he use it, but he gave entire talk in Sublime Text, and he was using some of it was just switching tabs, but he did some crazy stuff that I didn't know you could do. I've switched over to PHP Storm. It was too slow on my computer. I switched back to Sublime Text, and Caleb Porzio worked at Titan at the time, and he created a channel that was called Convince Me to VS Code. And it was before he'd made Make VS Code Awesome, but he would just drop things in there bit by bit. And I was like, you know what? It feels like the healthy middle space. Like if I'm not going to go the whole way to full IDE and I want to step above text editor, because I wrote a blog post about like how to set up Sublime Text for PHP and stuff like that. And it was good. But when those plugins broke, I just didn't know what to do because all of the momentum was kind of living in VS Code. I moved to VS Code, and it's Sublime Text spiritual successor. It's a text editor with better features. It's not a full IDE, but it's much more. It's built more like it was meant to do smarter things. Whereas Sublime Text, it almost kind of felt like some of the stuff was kind of layered on top. So yeah, what's like a Vim adoption like at Titan, if any?
We have at least 2 people who are full-on Tmux, Linux, Vim. I would say at least half of the programmers use Vim bindings in whatever thing they're in. I think we probably only have 2 guys that are like actually living. And then like when I screen share with them, I'm like, Vim didn't used to be able to do that. And they're using, what's the new one that
NeoVim.
Yeah, they're using NeoVim. They're using Tmux. Their screens have ASCII art all over them. Yeah. It's completely different than anything I've ever seen before. I'm sure they can teach us all about it.
It's pretty sweet. Yeah.
Yeah. I've gone full Vim before, and it was unsustainable in ways that are solved by their setups. Their setups, they're flying between different things, and I'm like, oh, I couldn't do that when I used it. So
yeah. Yeah.
Do you know if you guys have any full-time Vim folks at
definitely
Laravel?
Jess Archer.
Yeah, of course.
I almost said the product we're revealing at Laracon AU. I almost said on the
I would have
X
bleeped
team
it.
or whatever. Jess is using Vim pretty hardcore, I think. I don't know if any others are, though, actually. Maybe some of the infrastructure guys do. I don't know, but maybe that's just my stereotypical infrastructure guy thinking. I don't know.
Got it. I'm trying to think if we have a couple PHP Storm users. I almost come back to PHP Storm on a regular basis because I see some of the niceties that they have, and I'm like, but I don't write enough code in a day-to-day to probably make it worth switching over. So
yeah. I've been trying to write code a couple hours a day. Usually it's like some at night, some in the day. to just keep like my Laravel chops up, and as we build Laravel Cloud, since I'm not actually involved a lot in the day-to-day coding of that, not getting like rusty and feeling in touch with how it feels to write Laravel apps is still pretty important, I think. So that's what I was thinking about editors just yesterday, actually, when I did the AI stuff. I wrote a Livewire component. It was a Volt component, but it was using class-based Livewire syntax. And it was basically like a simple form for creating a new like company in this app. And I fed it into ChatGPT, the whole component, since the Livewire and the HTML was like in one file. And I was like, could you write like Livewire tests for this? Just basic tests for creating some validation stuff, because it can see the back end and the front end, in the component. And it spit out the test class, and I was like, holy cow, this is like pretty much exactly what I would have written. It was like success test. It had a few failure states around like invalid emails and stuff. And it used Livewire testing helpers and everything. And I was like, geez, this is actually pretty crazy. I almost modified like nothing of what it spit out. So I was pretty blown away by that. But it got me thinking about like the cursor editor and stuff, which I haven't tried yet, but I'd like to try.
Yeah, and it's interesting because on the one hand, I hear these stories, and then on the other hand, like I've tried a little bit of that stuff, and I've never spent enough time on it to decide whether I'm like, have I hit the initial bump of like getting used to it? But I've also read all these articles saying it slows people down overall, even though you kind of have that feeling of the boost. And I have a sense that if it becomes long-term helpful, it's going to be some sense of like, it's not just having it. There's got to be some element of knowing how to use it and when to use it. And even maybe at some point we might have customizations in the editors that allow you to determine which types of prompts you do and don't want, when you want the completions and when don't you. Because it seems like apparently just turning it on overall in the whole industry, maybe not on a person-by-person basis, on the whole industry has decreased kind of productivity. But I'm still curious, especially as I have a team of people who I want to be really productive. I'm like, what's the policy here? So
yeah, I do wonder if it would have slowed me down. Like if I would have tried to use it to generate the form, the whole page that I was trying to build, I do feel like that would have been time consuming rather than just like using the Tailwind classes myself and getting exactly how I wanted. But for testing, for like the grunt work, boilerplate, it was helpful. So I'm curious to see if that pans out as I keep working on this stuff.
And I think one cool thing there is that you knew a thing that it would be good for and would not be exciting for you to do, versus turning it on wholesale and having it write the whole thing alongside with you. So that's why I'm like, I think there's some intelligence there about how to use it well. So
yeah, totally.
All right. Oh, my next question. Can you tell me about the open source pledge? There's an image that went around recently, and I've actually had open source pledge open in a tab for weeks at this point, but there was an image that went semi-viral of something Times Square, I assume it was, that's saying open source pledge, and Laravel is one of the groups there. So could you kind of tell us a little bit about open source pledge and also a little bit about kind of your involvement with it?
Yeah. Open source pledge is an initiative that was started by Sentry, a company we have worked with a lot in the past at Laracons, going back all the way to 2017, I think. Yeah. They started Open Source Pledge, which basically, I think the gist of it is that you pledge $2,000 per year per full-time developer that you have on staff to give back to open source initiatives. I think the hope is that they're upstream packages that you benefit from at your company, basically, that you're giving back to. So for us, a really obvious one is like the PHP Foundation. Also things like Composer, which we're already donating a little bit of money to. Things like that. But so we committed to that. We were already donating, I want to say something like, I don't remember the exact dollar amount. We were already donating something around $20K or something a year to open source. And so we'll bump that up a little bit. I think primarily to PHP Foundation. But it's just an initiative, to sort of raise awareness, I guess, and financial contributions back to upstream open source developers that are historically, undercompensated for the amount of value that they put out into the world. And I know that, this is sort of a big topic right now with the WordPress stuff and open source in general. I don't think that, open source is open source, and if you put something out there as open source, you should sort of not expect to be paid for it because you made it open source. And if you wanted to be paid for it, you should have just charged in the first place. But at the same time, I think it's really great for companies to recognize the value that open source developers are putting out into the world and to contribute back to those projects, is to repay some amount of the time, the developers put into the project and spend maintaining it and bug fixing and things like that. So yeah, that's the gist of it. And there was sort of a marketing campaign around, raising awareness around giving back to open source, because there are, of course, multi-billion-dollar companies that are built on the backs of open source software, even going down all the way down to like Nginx, and PHP itself, which are both open source pieces of software.
Yeah. And I would say that, like, as someone who runs a company and works with companies a lot, if your company would be in really bad shape if a particular piece of open source software stopped being maintained and you don't have the ability / interest to maintain it if it does become unmaintained, that is a reason why, even if that person could have charged for it in the first place, it behooves you to help it be financially sustainable so that person doesn't burn out and then stop doing the project, right? So I'm like, you don't owe them money, but from a purely pragmatic financial perspective, stability perspective as a company, it is valuable to you to ensure that those pieces of tooling that you rely on every day stay reliable,
Yeah. And it's crazy because literally every software company in the world depends on open source to some extent, I would imagine. If you're running on a Linux server or you're,
right,
whatever you're doing, you're probably hitting open source software.
Yeah. So you mentioned WordPress, and I prep you about this ahead of time. Do you want to touch WordPress, or do we just leave it be because it's too spicy right now?
We touched on this a little bit on Prime's podcast the other day, where I actually am not super educated on the WordPress ecosystem. I mean, the only thing I see is that it looks very dramatic, and I think some of Matt's asks of WP Engine are pretty big, like the 8% revenue share. I'm not sure if that really makes sense, but I can't say I have a super educated opinion on all the ins and outs of that ecosystem. I see what other people see, and I see Matt appearing to act very dramatic and a little bit out there, but I don't know. That's just what I see.
Yeah, got it. Personally, I'm not going to share a lot. I would just say my shortest answer is the fact that this is all played out in a way that harms the careers of the probably tens of thousands of people who build WordPress apps for a living is really disappointing. That's the biggest thing for me. And I have thoughts about whose fault that is and why we are in the situation we're in, that in an attempt to not start a flame war between, us and the WordPress world with, or any leadership there or anything like that. I won't kind of say it, but basically, I feel like a lot of people who have spent decades, for many, building their entire careers around WordPress are in jeopardy and in fear in a time where it's already been really tough for the tech industry. Work's been tough to get, and that bums me out a lot. And so my hope is that they resolve it as quickly as possible so that they regain some stability, but also it definitely is like a cautionary tale. Some people said, well, what keeps Taylor from, going and doing that? I was like, first of all, Taylor's the most chill person you've ever met in your entire life. Like, but second of all, I do think that we have systems and structures set out in a way where, fingers crossed, we're safe from something like that happening. But yeah, I don't know. It just made me sad to see kind of what that would do for some people's lives. So,
yeah. Yeah, I don't even fully understand it. I think some people have raised the same question to me about like private equity, which is a little bit different than venture capital, and open source. But this WordPress situation to me, like from the outside, doesn't have anything to do with private equity. It has to do with, Matt asking WP Engine to give 8% of their revenue back to him and some trademark disputes. I don't know what like venture or private equity has anything to do with it, really. But
the only way it's even tangentially connected is because WP Engine was bought out by private equity. But WP Engine's been who WP Engine is since the very beginning, and nothing has the private equity firm didn't do or change something that now suddenly is making Matt do what he's doing, right? So it's only confusing. Similar by name. Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next one. So we have a question here about what does it look like for you to write the Laravel documentation? And I know that I think there was a tweet that you put out about or somebody put out a tweet about write the code samples first. I don't remember who I put this note a month ago, but I'm very curious from your perspective of as you're writing documentation. And let's start with some new documentation because I know that you often rewrite. But let's say it's a new piece of functionality that didn't exist before. What does writing those docs look like for you?
It's a good question. If it's something small, I write the docs after the feature is done. So like a PR comes into Laravel, I merge it. It's small enough to where I'm not going to like bug the person that contributed the PR to like write the docs themselves. It's just faster for me just to do it, and I'll just do it right then by looking at the pull request. But for larger stuff, a lot of times I do actually write some of the docs first. And this is a good example, like that infinite scrolling stuff I mentioned in Inertia, where we're making it better, is born out of the fact that Joe Tannenbaum started writing the docs for infinite scrolling. It was like, this just isn't quite right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, should be easier.
And that's kind of like I've said over the years, documentation driven development, where it just makes it very clear when you're having a hard time explaining something in the docs that the overall feature is not really like fully there or fully baked. So I find that super helpful for larger things to go ahead and write some docs first. And even the wording doesn't have to be perfect, but when you sit down and try to explain it, it really surfaces a lot of issues in your like overall design, I think, a lot of times. So yeah, that's generally how I approach it. For larger stuff that gets contributed to Laravel, sometimes I will actually ask the person who wrote it to take a first stab at writing the docs because they sort of fully understand it. And I don't expect it to be like perfect or that I'm just going to go in and hit the merge button without needing to make any changes, but at least gets me like a rough draft to go in and maybe clean up a little bit to bring it in line with the rest of the sort of voice of the rest of the Laravel docs so that it all feels cohesive. So yeah, that's the general approach for how we do docs at Laravel.
Yeah. One of the things that I know, just to kind of dig into that a little bit, you have rewritten the docs probably over a dozen times since I've known you, and each time you kind of come with a little bit of a different approach. But there's one thing that seems to be really consistent, which is you're always trying to think about a newcomer when you do it. And sometimes you structure the docs very heavily around indexing features and sections, and sometimes you've focused a little bit more around almost like a story, like do this, then this, then that. After now that you're over a decade into that process, do you have a preference between docs that are a little bit more like here's what you do first, then here's what you do next, or that are more like there's an introduction, but then it's just kind of an index, or do you think it should always be a mix, or it depends?
I think we'll have to have a mix, and I want to get more into that as we work on things throughout the rest of this year and into next year. I think we have a really great story around like that index approach of docs where, on the left side nav of the Laravel docs, we have like queues and authentication and encryption, and you can dig into any of these topics, and each individual page by itself is usually pretty good at explaining things. I think we need to do better around the getting started and even like the middle of your journey as a Laravel dev, telling the story in like one page as like a little bit more like our boot camp, where it walks you through building an app. And I think the boot camp did a pretty good job at this, but I think we can continue to sort of iterate on that overall idea, maybe within the docs themselves, around like more like guides, I guess you would say, more than like docs. So yeah, and I think that's become more and more apparent as Laravel has gotten bigger and the feature set has gotten wider, and there's more and more packages to where it's great to have all these individual docs that feel really nice in isolation, but how to tie it all together in a way where it doesn't feel overwhelming to someone that's new, and that they can kind of get a taste of what Laravel has to offer on one page rather than having to go through all of these separate pages.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I mean, we do think everyone should read through it eventually, but like that's not what you should have to do on day one in order to do something. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay. Well, we have a lot more questions, but I don't want to keep us for too long. There is, let's see, I feel like there's one other one. This one keeps coming up, so I'm just going to throw it in here just for fun, and then we'll wrap it. Did you ever start rewriting in another language, even just kind of like for fun? Like, did you ever kind of like do a little trial run of like a Rust-based Laravel or JavaScript-based Laravel? And if you did, what made you stick with PHP? And if not, if you were to start Laravel again today, what language do you think you'd reach for?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, I've never really seriously fired up like an empty directory where I started working on a new version of Laravel in another language. Reasons we stuck with PHP, I guess, so far have been, it's really what we know best. And I feel like recreating Laravel in another language is possible, of course. It would be time consuming, but it's more like recreating all of the packages, all of the ecosystem, even stuff like Nova and Horizon and Cashier and Socialite and Scout. It's just like overwhelming to think about. It would take many years, I think, to like get it even back up to like feature parity with Laravel is now. And then Laravel's, of course, going to be further along a few years down the road. So it's just a really big undertaking that I'm not sure is really feasible, at this point.
Yeah.
If I were going to do it in another language, I think one of the obvious answer is probably like JavaScript, just because you can use one language on the front end and back end, and that's always going to be JavaScript's sort of, killer feature,
Yeah.
Other languages I'm interested in or think are cool are Elixir, and that's kind of it, honestly. Ruby has sort of done their Rails thing, and even Elixir, has Phoenix, which is sort of that full stack Rails Laravel-like experience in that language. I get asked all the time, like Laravel for JavaScript, and why doesn't it really exist? And I know people have attempted this, of course, with like Inertia.js, and have gotten pretty good, pretty far along, I guess, in like recreating that Laravel experience, but it never seems to gain the critical mass adoption of something like Remix or Next or even Nuxt or something like that.
Yeah.
And, I don't know why that is. People theorize on that, but it just hasn't really seemed to take hold. And I don't think it's for lack of trying, really. I think it's just a different culture and different vibe and approach to writing apps over there.
Yeah. Yeah, and also there's probably something to be said with timing. We've talked about this before, but anytime one of my favorite podcasters, Guy Raz, he interviews business creators, and at the end he's like, how much of it was skill and how much of it was luck? And I don't remember exactly his words, but like, I'm not saying that Laravel was luck, but there is elements of like the right place, the right time, the right people, the right connection. And so I definitely think that maybe there is a day in the future, or was a day in the past, where a framework like this in JavaScript will work, or maybe there's a person or a moment or whatever, there's so many different things. But I agree with you. Like I hear people all the time be like, well, what about it for, and as far as I know, Adonis is that. I've never used it, but from everyone who's I've heard try it out, but it just doesn't seem to be picking up steam. And that's, again, no fault of theirs. And maybe the day will come where all of a sudden it blows up. Great. Love that. Like friends of the podcast, let's go. But it doesn't seem to be the case right now of what the JavaScript world is looking for. So, okay, so I think I'm going to wrap it there. I think all the other things that we have are kind of a little bit different vibe. Is there anything you wanted to talk about or share that we have not got a chance to talk about today?
Not really. Stay tuned for Laracon Australia. I guess that's where we'll be making our other big announcement for the year. And we're actually going to start kicking off Cloud early access later this year as well, with the first group of it may only be 10 really trusted people next month. So we're just a few weeks out from that, actually. So we've actually been working on sort of the whole access code invite system. Nuno demoed that for us this morning.
Nice.
But in the months following that, we'll be letting, dozens and eventually hundreds of people in on early access. Cool. So stay tuned for that, and then stay tuned for Laracon Australia.
Yeah, and so today's October 16th, so Laracon Australia is in 2.5 weeks for us, which means by the time this is released, it'll be maybe a week or two out. So, and I've already got some microphones lined up for us at Laracon Australia, so you all can look forward to some special recordings while we're there.
Nice.
Well, Taylor, it was great hanging out with you as always, and for the rest of you, thanks for spending some time with us.
Thanks, everybody.